Thank you so much for agreeing to speak to us. It's really helpful.
No, good to see you both. Excuse me. Right.
So basically, we in Durham have been running a bit of an investigation this year into how the pandemic has affected students both in Durham and nationally, and how the government, maybe their lack of response, what they've been doing, and how universities, how basically what the kind of response around students and from students has been. So we just had a couple of questions to ask you, if that's all right, about the whole education system and stuff.
Yes, so we wanted to ask first about private accommodation. So prices in Durham are already much higher than the national average, and significantly the highest in the Northeast compared to other universities. And for lots of students, it's an incredible financial burden, and obviously they're being told not to go into private accommodation at the moment. And we spoke to the local MP, Mary Foy, about this, and you know, they said it's a big injustice, and you've spoken about this as well. So what can or should the government be doing here? And what do you think they're not doing enough in?
Okay, well, I think part of the problem with students and rent is being revealed by COVID, but not caused by COVID. Because I think there's a longer running and deeper issue, I think, than just people, the injustice and unfairness of paying for rent for accommodation you're not allowed to use. I think, as you've pointed out, student accommodation is often expensive, it's often small, you're often pressurized into signing up for contracts way before you actually need to. There are no break clauses in your contract, and often the accommodation is really quite poor. So I think there's a bigger piece of work for the government to be looking at, to say, well, generally, students in private accommodation, are they being treated fairly? Because, excuse me, sorry, because it's my understanding that Durham University have refunded students' rent for the accommodation that they're not being allowed to use. And we have to point out that Durham University is in a financially successful position and actually has done quite well throughout this pandemic. So I'm very pleased that it is refunding the rent for all of its accommodation. But as you said, people in private accommodation can't. And we need to also look at the responsibility that universities have towards all of their students and the accommodation that they are actually using. And there's an even greater injustice. I know obviously we're talking about Durham University, but there's a greater injustice for some universities which have no university accommodation, and all their students therefore are in private accommodation, and all their students therefore are paying for accommodation they can't use. So I think once we get out of this pandemic, there needs to be some work, and I'm looking to lead some work, working with the NUS, working with different student unions to say, how do we deal with the greater injustice that students face around rent? Because in Scotland, you probably know, being quite near to it, that they have a 28-day break clause in all of their contracts. So they've been able to give notice and 28 days later to leave their private contracts, which of course is not an option available for students studying in English universities. But that's to do obviously with private rent. So I think that's something we should be looking at as well. So I mean, as Mary's already said to you, we think it's an injustice, we think it's unfair. As it stands within the law, because it's a private rental contract between a student and an individual private landlord, in a legal sense, there isn't anything you can't do anything, because if you break your contract, then obviously you're legally responsible for something you've all signed as adults, which is why I'm saying we need to get to the bigger point, not just the point about this few weeks. So all you can try and do is either the government look at increasing student hardship to help them with the funds, and just continue to put as much pressure on these private landlords as possible. Now, if you have purpose-built private student accommodation, so Unite, UPP, those big contracting providers, then of course the universities can have much more influence over them, because they're often linked to an individual university, and so they have a relationship with them. So I think we'd be urging university to say, put as much pressure on them as possible, because I think everybody sort of agrees that there's this great injustice, but we're not going to, I think, fix it during COVID. This needs to be looked at more seriously. And what I don't want to happen is at the end of this pandemic, everybody forget about all the problems students have had with rent.
Yep, completely. Thank you. Next question is kind of more specifically about Durham, but kind of again about the wider kind of government response. So Durham University had the worst COVID rates proportionally to any university in the UK. So we were hit very hard by it. One kind of explanation for this might have been the fact that we returned later than lots of other unis. So we came back early October, whereas lots of other unis went back August, September, and obviously the rates were getting worse as the year went on. Do you think the government should have mandated and like legalized that universities shouldn't have like welcomed students back, and they should have put their foot down and said students don't come back to uni in September, October, whenever it was? Or do you think it was something that the government was correct in saying that universities it was their prerogative to decide when students came back?
No, I mean, we were calling for, we were saying that we should be looking at things like a staggered return to university, because it was quite clear as we were getting towards the end of summer that the numbers were starting to rise. And I sort of spoke about it on the 9th of September. I think I sent a letter through to the university's minister saying, we're looking at moving over 1 million people around the country during the time of a pandemic when numbers of cases are starting to rise. We can't then be surprised when we see accelerated cases of COVID across the country. So I think it's something that the government should have been more aware of and should have been ready to sort of respond to. But if you sort of rewind to think back, in summer we were being told, eat out to help out, go back to work, it's your duty to go to the pub, as somebody asked, I think the Prime Minister during Prime Minister's questions. So the whole narrative was about opening up, everybody going back. And I think the government were just too slow to recognise the fact that numbers were starting to rise, and this huge problem that suddenly, in the space of only 2 weekends, most universities move everybody around and transfer everyone all around the country. So the increase in virus was, I think, expected and could have been prevented had the government issued guidance, which, you know, in all fairness to the government, it did over Christmas. So it did over Christmas say only these students should come back because of practical courses, you know, unless they have to. So there was no reason why it couldn't have done that in September as well. Now, my criticism of the Christmas guidance, of course, was that it was still so late. So I had students contacting me and vice chancellors contacting me saying, have you heard when this guidance is going to come out about January? Because the vice chancellors were getting students contact them going, you know, when am I allowed to go back? Can I go back? You know, because everyone needs to plan their lives and what they're doing. Vice chancellors are saying, we don't know. And we're still waiting and waiting for the government to produce their guidance. So I think even though January was an improvement on September, I still think we're lacking that clarity, and we're in danger of being in the same situation again when we're talking about final year practical students saying, when am I going to be able to get back and use the labs, or engineering students or architecture students or a dance, drama, art, you know, any student with a practical component saying, when am I going to get back to university? And we still haven't really got that answer from government. I don't expect the government to have a magic ball. I don't expect they're going to be able to predict exactly where the pandemic's going to be in a few months, but some key sort of indicators would be helpful. So, you know, if in an area the virus is at level X, then you can have this happen, you know, just to give some kind of indication of how low levels need to be before students are allowed back, I think would be really helpful. So, but again, we're sort of waiting and waiting.
And throughout this time as well, there's been a big sort of mental health epidemic as well, it's been called. And, you know, 11 students dead nationally as of November, and one actually, quite sadly, recently, a sudden death of a Durham student as well. Is the government doing enough in terms of student mental health, and is this hardship fund that's been provided going to, do you think is enough to sort of alleviate some of those issues?
Sadly not. I mean, I've been doing some events around the country talking to students, and nearly every event I've done so far, there's been a really tragic story of people suffering with their mental health. I mean, we are social animals as human beings. We're not made to be isolated alone in our rooms. And if we think of the first year students who went away in September, they went away, they were put in, as we all are, you put in accommodation with people you don't know. You've then all got COVID and you're all sort of trapped there for a few weeks. I mean, it's not a surprise that people are suffering with their mental health. And some universities have done some fantastic work in supporting students, and others, if I'm being honest, haven't done as well as they could have done. The government have given some money to Student Minds, which is welcome, but I think there's an awful lot more they can do. I think we've seen some great work from some of the student unions in supporting people with their mental health by offering those social activities and stopping that that loneliness. I mean, one person saying to me, he's not seen another human being in the flesh for a week or so. I mean, that's not how we're meant to live, is it? I mean, it really isn't. And I think, so again, the work the student unions doing are fantastic. And I'm slightly worried by the rhetoric that's coming out from government that seems to be quite against student unions at the moment. And I think we should be instead supporting them and saying, actually, they're doing really well throughout this pandemic. Let's help them be even better. So that's slight of concern to me. I want to do a bit more working with Rosanna, our Shadow Secretary of State for Mental Health as well, looking specifically about what can be done to support students. But we've got to look at some of the causes. Some of the causes that students are telling me is money worries. They're worried about their finances. They're worried about not being able to pay their rent. They haven't got their part-time work or jobs that they used to rely on. I'm not sure if some of you saw the Channel 4 News international students queuing up for food banks because they're unable to access. I mean, that is going to impact your mental health. If you're worried about not being able to eat, it's going to affect you mentally. And so I think there again, universities need to step up and the government needs to really step up about that as well. The other thing that students tell me is affecting them with anxiety is when they graduate, where are the jobs going to be? What's going to happen to them? What is, you've accumulated all this debt, you're just about to leave university, you're going into the world of work, what's going to be there? And again, the government have introduced Kickstarter for young people up to 24, but that's not suitable for students. It's not a suitable scheme if we're looking for graduate level employment. So instead, the government could start to have conversations with universities about paid internship programs, how we can support businesses coming in and working more with universities. Some universities have done a fantastic job of online careers fairs and opening up those opportunities for students, but some really haven't. So there's an awful lot of worry and anxiety out there. And I think there's only so much treating of the symptoms we can do. We need to look at treating the causes. And some of the causes are that financial worry, that worry about their future, and that isolation and loneliness. And I think if we look at how do we tackle isolation and loneliness, financial concerns, and future job worries, then we can then start to have a real impact on supporting students' mental health.
Yep. You mentioned earlier about the SU's role in universities, and we spoke to Durham's SU president a couple of weeks ago, and she said that one of the reasons that students should be allowed to return back to university was if they needed a more comfortable environment to work with, and the academic reasons should be a valid reason to return to university. Given that lots of students, especially in Durham, lots of people have come up from hundreds of miles away, do you think that that is a valid reason to return to university? Because there has been lots of confusion over what constitutes students being allowed to travel. And would you agree that academics is a valid reason?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question and really important point. I think if we look at what's happening with schools, if we sort of try and make a similar comparison into who's allowed within the school building. So there's a classification, obviously, for vulnerable. So an vulnerable comprising anyone with an education, health and care plan, but also looked after children, various other categories as well. I think most universities are applying a similar kind of thinking when they're talking about who should be allowed back in campus. Of course, children in care should be allowed back in campus because they often don't have anywhere else to go. Students with disabilities and needs who might not be able to access or have the resources that they need at home. But then we've also got to look at in schools, you allow children who don't have access to digital devices to actually go to school. So I think universities should be looking at each student as an individual and saying, well, okay, what are your specific needs? If you're a student from a more disadvantaged background and you don't have your own space, you don't have broadband, you don't have your own equipment, then I think there's a strong case to be made for you being allowed to be on campus and continuing to have that access. But everything has to be balanced against public health risk and the fact that you want to at all times try and limit the number of people in contact with each other because of the spread of COVID. So I think, to be fair, on most universities, they're sort of looking at students as individuals, but the big difference, of course, between students and school pupils is students are adults. So they're ultimately responsible for their own actions and their own behaviour. And if as an adult, you say, I need to return to university, that there isn't an awful lot the university can do. And my instinct, unproven, but my feeling is there are an awful lot of students back at university in their campuses who probably wouldn't, I'm not saying shouldn't have to, but I don't know, but there's probably more than people think there is back at university now. I was talking to one student who said they wanted to go back because they were paying their accommodation, so they wanted to use it. And I was thinking, it's not maybe a valid reason to return to your university. I understand the thinking, but it's not a valid reason. And my impression is I don't think the government actually understand exactly where students are studying right now as well as they possibly should do.
Can I just quickly ask as well, and this is very relevant to a letter that's recently been sent to the government by a group of MPs, Labour MPs especially, on tuition fees. And there seems to be this sort of catch-22 where the university is saying that they won't refund tuition fees until the government does anything, and the government is saying that they're waiting for the universities to for communication from them. So what do you think, especially since you're sort of not a signatory to that letter? What's sort of your perspective on tuition fees and whether they should be refunded going forward?
Okay, just to sort of clear up on the letter and on the EDM, as anyone in the shadow cabinet doesn't sign joint letters or EDMs, so just sure. It's just one of those points that's worth pointing out, because I've also been asked why I've not signed Zara Sultana's EDM as well, and you don't if you're a shadow minister or shadow secretary of state. But on the points within the letter, and the points within the EDM, I mean, the Labour Party's committed in 2017, committed in 2019, and they're still committed to not having tuition fees, and that remains Labour's policy. But in terms of sort of refunding them, when I think this individual consumeristic model of students using the Consumer Rights Act is complicated. I don't think it's fair for each student, because it relies on you as an individual student being able to fill in a very lengthy, complicated form and make the case as an individual why you should be given a refund. And I think, as we've just talked about students with mental health problems, if you're suffering with anxiety and your mental health, you're not going to be able to fill in a complicated form like this and make an argument for tuition fee refunds, especially since, as you probably know, you have to go through the complaints procedure first before you can then sort of take it further to look at asking a refund. And this was raised actually in questions yesterday, day before, by Diane Abbott asked a really good question sort of about this. So I think this, where the government are saying, oh, we're going to make it easier for students to refund through the Office for Students, it discriminates in itself, because, as I said, you're not going to be able to do that. So if you're looking at sort of what the APPG for Students came out with, which is a cross-party group looking at this issue, I think the NUS said if you got a discount of they say if you got £3,000 off, because some people are saying, oh, well, the Open University only charged £6,000, therefore we're getting an Open University experience. I think you'd only benefit if your starting salary was 43,000 going up to, I think, 120,000 with an increase every year throughout your working life, for you to get a benefit from actually having that tuition fee cut, because most people pay their tuition fees back when they graduate. So it would really only benefit students from very wealthy backgrounds who've already paid their tuition fees up front. So in terms of I understand it, it's the injustice and it's the symbolism, but in terms of would it make a difference to your pocket as a graduate? Not really. But that's not to say that, as you say, the Labour Party it doesn't support tuition fees anyway. So what I'm getting instead from students is the overwhelming message that what they actually prioritise right now is that hardship fund and the money to get through the day-to-day and the mental health support. And as I say, the rent seems to be a much bigger issue when I've been talking to them than the tuition fees. I think the tuition fees there's a sense of injustice about you leave with so much debt. I agree. It's not right and it's not fair. But the number one issue is how am I going to get through next week when I haven't got a part-time job and I've got no money coming in?
Yep. Kind of adding to that, obviously that's going to create a level of kind of student anxiety about money, but also lots of students this year have been particularly worried about the academic side of things and the lack of a safety net policy. So the Russell Group came out quite early on and said that they weren't going to do a no detriment policy, or they weren't going to call it that, and that prompted a strong backlash from students. People got very angry. People's mental health really declined. People were very worried. So Durham specifically will be deciding their they've decided their safety net policy already, but it's yet to be released to students. Before they do release it, what do you think, I mean, not Durham specifically, but universities more generally should be doing to provide clarity or to support students with the with the safety net policy?
Yeah, I think you're right. Even though all the Russell Group came out and said we don't support no detriment, it feels like they're climbing down in a sort of slightly quiet way by introducing their mitigating circumstances policy or extenuating circumstances policy, whatever you want to call it. It feels like another way of saying, oh, actually, maybe no detriment is something we should look at. So it'd be interesting to see Durham's when it's published and when it's out there. I think universities and most, again, the vast majority of people working in universities are absolutely fantastic, and the vast majority of universities have done an amazing job in difficult circumstances. I think it's always worth saying that, because then I say but I do think, of course, you have to take into account that you're studying through a pandemic. I mean, goodness me, I mean, if having a pandemic isn't a mitigating circumstance, then what on earth is? I mean, not being able to access the resources you need, being away from home, not being able to get to the library. I mean, all these things, of course, are going to impact on how successfully you're able to study, and therefore the results you're able to get. And I think universities need to just be sensible and realistic about this, need to look at applying a policy that's fair. I mean, one student was telling me, not a Durham student, was telling me that she'd had a close bereavement, and she had to access the mitigating circumstances policy, have a letter from the doctor explaining that she'd had a bereavement. Well, the last thing you're going to do in a pandemic is try and is to use up a doctor's appointment to get a letter to say that you're bereaved. I think there needs to be more just sensible. I think people need to be a bit more realistic and a bit more sensible about this. But I think the bigger point that I think sometimes misses out on this conversation is, you've gone to university after reading a syllabus that said during your course you're going to be taught this, this and this, develop these skills and develop this understanding, and then you signed up, got yourselves into a huge amount of debt and said, yes, that's what I want. Now, when you graduate, your employer, when they take you on, will expect you to know and be able to do and understand, all these different points, because if you're whatever you've graduated in, law or whatever subject it is, that's what they're expecting from it. So I think there's a point at which, so when are you going to make up that lost learning? When are you going to make up the bits that you haven't been able to learn? And I think that's where the conversation needs to be right now. So if you're a lab student, when are you going to get access to the labs? When are you going to be able to develop those skills that you graduate with them? Because the conversation is focused so much on school pupils and lost learning and catch up and national tutoring programs. But what about university students? What about if you're a third year university student? You're going to be expected to graduate at the same time in summer, despite having nearly a year of interruption to your learning, where, if we're being honest, you might not yet have developed the skills that you need for your course. And the focus being on no detriment is fine, but I think we should also say, so when is this lost learning going to happen? And I think we need to be, then the university is talking about, so are we looking at extending the term in, by a couple of weeks in summer? Are we looking at inviting students back in Easter when there might be less of the virus around? But are we going to block some of this skills component and bring students in on a more densely packed timetable? But ultimately, if you're a third year student, you're going to be saying, time's ticking, I'm graduating soon, I haven't actually finished my course yet. And I think that's a conversation that they need to be having right now.
Yep. Can I just quickly ask about the treatment of students as a whole? So the government has kind of arguably continually scapegoated students. It's kind of constantly been kind of saying, oh, students are breaking lockdown, where granted, maybe a very small minority of students, as any other demographic of the population, has broken lockdown rules. Whereas I would say the vast majority of students have stuck to them. And often the government and the media have kind of pointed out the students, and they've really highlighted these few and far between house parties that have been happening and stuff. But what do you think the government, rather than scapegoating us and making us kind of blaming us, what do you think the government should be doing to support students kind of more holistically, and what should their kind of steps forward be to rather than blame students, help them?
Yeah, and there's been an awful lot of lazy attacks in the newspaper against students. I mean, we've seen a lot of this with all the free speech stuff that's been going on in the news, and sort of attacking students, and all those sort of students being woke and this, that, and the other, that we can sort of read in the populist press, which is not helpful and not fair. And you're quite right to highlight students being blamed for the spread of COVID-19 when, as we said before, it's inevitable. You move over 1 million people around the country in the space of a fortnight. Don't be surprised during a pandemic if the virus spreads. You can't blame the students for doing that. We should blame the policies that allowed so many people to move all together at the same time. So I think you're right. I think, and the messages coming out to students all the time are feeling quite negative. I think the government needs to show a bit more understanding of the financial difficulties students face. You might have seen last night, news came out of Northern Ireland have just announced a support package for all of their students. So that's now, if you're studying in English universities, you're at a disadvantage compared to studying in a Welsh university, in a Northern Ireland university, a Northern Irish university, or a Scottish university. I mean, people studying in English universities are getting the worst deal out of all of the nations of the United Kingdom. And I think that's something we should be talking about. There isn't that equality across the different nations within the United Kingdom. And that's not down to a student's nationality. So if you're Welsh studying in English university, you might be feeling particularly cheesed off, to put it that way, that your government is actually providing an awful lot of support, but yet you've come over here to study and you're not getting the same treatment. So I think we should be thinking about graduation and next steps. I mean, students have had a really difficult year. As we've said, there's financial concerns, there's been mental health concerns, there's bereavement, there's isolation and loneliness, there's turning their worlds upside down, and all the difficulties they face. They're going to be graduating into a really difficult job market. So where's the support going to come from them to actually help them, to make it feel that all this was worthwhile? Because at the end of this, if you graduate and you go and get a good job, then you'll be thinking it was worthwhile. I've gone through this, we've had a bit of pain, but we've come out the other side, I've got my degree and I'm starting my career. What we don't want to happen is for people then to be left unemployed or having to take jobs which are not which are not graduate level jobs. So what's going to be there at the end of this then to support them, and where's their help going to be? Which I'm saying, like things like paid internships or paid support, or what's the conversations the government having with businesses? What's going to be done to make the pain sort of worthwhile? And I think rather than sort of lazy attacks on student unions and attacks on free speech, maybe the government could actually start praising, as you've quite rightly said, the vast majority of students who have followed the rules, done what they've been asked to do, suffered because of it, and have just for the whole part of it just got on and I think behaved brilliantly throughout this pandemic. And I think that needs to be said more.
I'm quite aware we've kept you for longer than we said we would.
That's okay, because I was late, so that's okay.
Thank you so much for speaking to us. It's been really, really helpful. It's been great.
Fab. Lovely to chat to you both.
This is Purple Radio.